Hey, it's Wednesday of Holy Week. Thank you for joining me these last couple of days. If you're here with us today for the first time, just stay with us for a few moments. I want to share some thoughts with you about what's happened this week, this last week of Jesus' life on this earth. Wednesday, the scripture records no events on Wednesday that took place that day. It's kind of interesting. It appears that during that day, Jesus and his disciples had gone back to the little town called Bethany on the evening before, which they did every day. Bethany was a very special place to Jesus. He very often went there to kind of get away and relax and be with his friends. For in Bethany, that's where we found the home of some people that were very special to him. You'll remember the story of Lazarus and then his sister Mary and Martha that we often hear about. They were people who loved Jesus dearly. They cared for Jesus and his disciples. Whenever they were in the area, they would seem to go there and stay. And that was where they were even on the day before Palm Sunday morning when they went into Jerusalem. They had stayed in Bethany. Now, Wednesdays, nothing's recorded, and it's not always wise to speculate, but I'm going to speculate today because the only thing recorded in Matthew's gospel for Wednesday is for him to recall what had taken place in Bethany a few days before. Where you see when Jesus and the disciples had stopped in Bethany on their way to Jerusalem and stayed there, Matthew recalls a story that John recorded as it took place in his gospel. It's a story of a dinner they had in the home of a man by the name of Simon, who was only known as Simon the leper. So what we assume from that is that Simon had been a leper that Jesus had healed, and he had opened his home to Jesus and held a dinner for him. He had to have been healed. Other than that, Simon wouldn't even been able to stay in the city of Bethany because lepers were banned from interaction with other people. But he opened his home and Jesus gathered there. Along with some others, there was Jesus and Mary and Martha, and Lazarus was there, Simon was there, plus the 12 disciples. And as they all gathered around, something took place that night as they sat at the table or sat on the floor, gathered around where would be the eating area. As normal, Martha, the servant, was serving, and Mary was doing what Mary always did. She was serving Jesus. In other words, she was sitting at his feet, and we read the story that she had anointed him that night with oil, a special oil called nard, very expensive oil. This past Sunday at our church, we talked about a very similar occasion where Jesus was anointed by a woman who had formerly been a prostitute, whose life had been touched and changed by Jesus, and so overwhelmed with Jesus that the change had come into her life, she came in and anointed him with an oil that probably was worth nearly a year's wages. And Mary was doing the same thing that night. And while Jesus was commending Mary for what she was doing that was good, John tells us that Judas began to criticize. And Matthew indicates that some of the other disciples joined in. And while Jesus was sitting there praising Mary for the worship and the honor that she was showing to him, Judas and the other disciples were sitting back judging her. Same way they did the woman in the other story. Sitting back judging her. It's like they had forgotten who they were with and what his purpose was. Like I said, it's not good to speculate. But as I read this story, it spoke to me about remembering what Jesus has done for me and how easy it is for us who are followers of Christ, just like the disciples. They were with him every day, face to face. But for us who are followers of Christ, just like those men, to forget what Jesus has done in our life and then go about living our life, acting, behaving, thinking, having the same attitudes that we had before we ever met Christ. How do we know when that's coming into our life? Well, there's just one caution that comes to me out of this little story. And the caution is when our thoughts and attitudes begin to turn away from Jesus and start turning towards us, and we start thinking about how this impacts us, then that's a caution sign that we need to do what Mary did and get back on our knees and on our face before him and worship him and honor him. See, in that story, Judas criticized because he said, hey, we could have given this money to the poor. But John records that Judas didn't have any intention of giving that money to the poor. He was just giving forth a judgment because he liked to keep the money for himself. So here's the word of encouragement, the word of caution. If there's some things that have happened in your life that when you begin to look around and observe others or other things that happen, and you find yourself fighting with the temptation to be judgmental and critical and think about how it impacts you rather than how it impacts your witness for the Lord, then that's a time to sit back and say, maybe I need to follow the example of Mary and worship at the feet of Jesus and not the disciples. Because when Jesus came to Mary, when Jesus came to the woman that we talked about on Sunday, who was a former prostitute, he changed their lives. And when lives are changed for Christ, it makes an impact in the world around us. Jesus said that Mary would be remembered for what she did. There was another person that was always remembered for what they did, and that was Judas. So what's our legacy going to be? That we stood faithful to Christ, honored him in our life, or that we turned away from him and focused upon what we wanted. I hope that this week, that today especially, we would all be reminded that when we begin to focus on ourselves, maybe it's time that we focus upon Jesus and the change that he has brought into our lives before we forget about that. God bless you guys. I hope this is helpful for you today. I look forward to talking with you again tomorrow.